This is Chavez here. We're on the last section of Chapter 10, 10.3, and we're going to talk about the theories of economic development today. There's a lot of them, so let's get started and get through them all. The first one that we're going to look at is modernization theory. All right. Well, if you think about this, development is becoming modern. It's the idea of progression, that you're going to progress slowly or quickly, but you're going to move forward. It's never backwards. It's only forward. It's the logical progression that goes from a traditional society into a modern society where you adopt all the advancements of a modern society. That would be things like advanced technology, urbanization, very high per capita incomes, a high quality of life, completed demographic transition, meaning that at some point your birth rate and your death rate are going to equal out, and individualism, the idea that the individual means more than just the state, democracy, and capitalism. Those two are always with it. So Rostow's model of inevitable development, that's what they call it now. When I first started teaching human geography, they called it Rostow's model of development. It was the only model of development. And it wasn't until, I would say about maybe 4 years into teaching this subject, and that would be like 15 years ago, that they began to criticize this model of development based on different theories coming out in the global marketplace. Okay, so this theory, let's go over this theory, because there's 6 stages to this theory, and it's always on the test. There's always going to be a question about this. The theory goes that all the developing economies pass through 6 stages of growth and advancement. Okay, the first one is the traditional societies, the subsistence agriculture. That's where everybody starts. We all actually starts with hunting gathering, but moves into subsistence agriculture. Okay, then you get into the preconditions for takeoff. These are established when an quote external intrusion unquote initiates political and economic change. Well, let me tell you this in simpler language. This external intrusion is when a developed country comes in and invests in the, say, for the infrastructure of a foreign country. And this is not because they just love this foreign country, but it's based on the economic advantage of doing business in that particular country. Countries can use foreign aid that they get from other countries to build airports, roads, transportation hubs, technology capabilities, all kinds of things that will make doing business with that country, a whole lot easier. Takeoff to sustained growth is the critical development stage, lasting perhaps 20 to 30 years. All this is industrialization. This is when countries begin to industrialize their manufacturing goods, and they're not just selling their raw materials to another country. They're now taking their raw materials, developing them into something, and selling those developed products to other countries. That's the developmental stage. Okay. The next one is the drive to maturity, and that's where you're going to see economic output growing faster than the population. So this idea of a drive to maturity indicates that not only is this country moving in a direction of post-industrialization, but they're also diversifying, and they're growing other types of economic activities, for instance, baking, tourism, universities, things like that. Then the next age, which I'm sure that you'll understand very easily, is the age of mass consumption. This would be about where the United States is right now, and most of the Western countries. Finally, we get to the post-industrial stage that's marked by a service industry. That would be the United States and most of the Western countries. And that's going to replace any kind of secondary activities as the principal sector of the economy. No longer will manufacturing be dominant. There'll still be manufacturing done. Every country has to do manufacturing, like every country has to do agriculture. But the primary focus of the country will now be in the service sector. We're talking tertiary and quinary. So the core periphery model, it's a little bit difficult to explain. If you look at it from inside of a country first, and then we'll move it out to the global stage. Inside of the country, the core periphery model is this. Let's look at the core and let's look at the periphery. It doesn't necessarily mean the outskirts of the country. The core areas of the country are places that are have accelerated economic development. For instance, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Those are all on the periphery of the United States. Yet they're considered core parts of this country. The periphery is actually located in those rural areas in the Midwest. Okay. It's the growth in the developing core that has to come at the expense of the periphery. Now let's take it out to the global look. If a country is a core country, the United States, Great Britain, France, these are all core countries, all these Western core countries. If they're a core country, they became wealthy at the expense of the peripheral countries. If you remember me talking about the Brant line, remember that those northern countries colonized the southern countries in the hemisphere and prevented them from developing their own businesses because it wasn't in their best interest. Now, there are exceptions to this. Many of the poorer nations of the South lie like partially or wholly within the mid-latitudes or the temperate elevations. Afghanistan, North Korea, and Mongolia are examples. Now, what we're looking at here, the exceptions would be Singapore and Malaysia, who are very, very prosperous. So this economic growth sets in motion a process of circular and what they call cumulative causation. It's constant. The core is constantly preying on the periphery, and the periphery can move from the periphery to the semi-periphery, even to the core, and they could even move back to the periphery again. If you think about Spain during the Age of Exploration, Spain was the richest country in the world. They were extremely wealthy, but they're not so wealthy anymore. Okay, they moved from the core in the 15th century to the semi-periphery. At one point, they were the periphery again, and then they moved back into the semi-periphery. So your status as a country doesn't always stay the same. It's not static. So dependency theory, this is another theory that's kind of interesting. It's the if you look at this map here, you're going to see the high, the middle, upper, and the middle, lower, and the low income and throughout the world. All right, and it's based on your GNI per capita. This is from an older map from 2007. So there's some changes here, but for our purposes, it's fine. Dependency theory claims that the development of the advanced core nations that we were just talking about in the slide before depend on the underdevelopment of the peripheral nations. Dependency theory argues that development creates underdevelopment. It's a barrier to development in many countries. And developing countries were made poor by their interactions with the advanced countries. They may have, at some point, have exceeded or past those developing countries if they hadn't had this interaction of being colonized with these developed countries. So dependency theory emerges from a big dissatisfaction with modernization theory and development programs, and especially as they're applied to places like Latin America. And it draws on Marx's economic ideas. Dependency theorists extend the core periphery model to the international global scene. So Wallerstein's world systems theory model. This is always on the test, so you'll have to make sure that you know what this really does mean. It was a theory that was developed by a sociologist named Emanuel Wallerstein, and he argued that international trade has led to a capitalist world economy. Now, this world system is based on wealth and power and is arranged according to influence. The core, the most dominant, that I was just talking about in the last two slides, the semi-periphery, and the periphery, which is the least dominant. It extends the core periphery model to the entire capitalist global world economy. On the international scene, core periphery contrasts are between Western Europe, Japan, the United States as these prosperous cores, and the least developed countries on the periphery of the global economy. So this theory says that the core controls key high-level functions in the global economy, such as corporate headquarters. I'll bring Nike back into this again. Nike's not the only one. I'm sorry I keep picking on it, but it's one that you will probably remember and you could use it as an example. Their headquarters are in the core, and their financial centers are in the core, and their stock exchanges are in the core, but not their factories. So this theory acknowledges that countries can shift from a peripheral position to a core position, and a semi-periphery of newly industrializing countries, those are the NICs, remember we talked about this before, they occupy that intermediate position between the core countries and the peripheral countries. If we're talking about the NICs, we're talking about places like South Korea, Taiwan, India. These are countries that are newly industrializing countries. So how does gender inequality play into this whole theory? Well, gender roles and stages of development are related to with a common belief that equality accompanies development. Not necessarily true. If you look at the list of countries that are they have the best gender equality, it's not going to be the United States, and we're a highly developed country. The highest gender equality countries are located in the northern hemisphere, of course, but they're also located in the northern latitudes, Finland, Sweden, those places, Norway, have the highest level of gender equality. And, the U.S. falls in about 17 to 21. I'm not sure exactly, but it's right around in that area for inequality. It appears that in the earlier phases of technological change and development, women seem to lose out rather than gain in status and rewards. And only recently, and only in the most developed countries, have gender-related contrasts been reduced within and between societies. While the development of natural resources played a vital role in the past in creating economic development, increasingly the structure of the world economy favors places that possess well-educated workers. They could be men or women, and the human capital is seen as a key contributor in a dynamic economy. So if you have 50% of your population as women and you are not developing them, you're not developing as a country. Most economically developed countries have expanded the rights of women over the past century, and many less developed countries still limit women's roles in society, and it's mostly through tradition and custom and law. Look at some alternative measures of development and well-being. The biggie is going to be the Human Development Index, HDI. Now, the HDI is used by the United Nations to rank a country's level of human development, and it has 3 dimensions of development used to calculate a country's HDI. That would be health, education, and living standards. So if you're looking at the measure of health, it's determined by the expectancy at birth, or the average number of years a newborn infant could expect to live. Access to education is measured by examining the mean or the average years of schooling and expected years of schooling. Living standards are measured by the gross national income per capita, or the total value of goods and services produced by a country's economy each year measured per person, per capita. This new one, the multidimensional poverty index, it measures the amount of deprivation in the same 3 categories. Life expectancy, education, and health, okay? And that is part of the new part of the HDI. So this ends our lectures on Chapter 10. Thank you.